In September of 1887, on the floodplain of Henan province in central China, a river that runs higher than the rooftops of the towns beside it pushes against an earthen wall built by human hands. The wall has held for a generation. In the last week of September, it stops holding. The water does not spill. It does not rise gently over the edge. It punches through a single weak point near the city of Zhengzhou, and within hours that single breach is a gap more than half a mile wide. Behind it stands a river carrying 1.5 billion tons of mud, moving downhill onto a plain where the ground is lower than the water that is coming for it. When the water stops moving, somewhere between 900,000 and 2 million people are dead. The exact number was never counted. There was no one left in some counties to do the counting. The flood covers an area of roughly 50,000 square miles, a sheet of water the size of the entire nation of England laid across the farmland of central China. 11 cities and more than 1,500 villages disappear beneath it. 2 million people who survive the water do not survive what comes after. The winter, the famine, the disease that moves through the refugee camps like a second flood made of something you cannot build a wall against. This is not the first time the Yellow River has done this. It is not the 10th time. In 2,500 years of written records, this river has broken its banks more than 1,500 times, and it has changed the entire path of its mouth to the sea 26 times, sometimes emptying hundreds of miles north of where it emptied the year before. The Chinese have a name for this river. They have had it for centuries. They call it China's sorrow. Not the Great River, not the Mother River. The sorrow. And the reason for that name is not history. It is not superstition. It is a physical fact you can measure with an instrument. And it is the same fact today that it was in 1887, and it is getting worse by a measurable amount every single year. Every great river on Earth has killed people. The Mississippi drowned the American South in 1927. The Ganges floods on a monsoon clock the way a clock keeps time. The Yangtze, a few hundred miles south, has its own body count in the millions. But those rivers flood the way you expect a river to flood. They rise, they overflow, they recede. The Yellow River is different, and the difference is the whole story. The river begins high on the Tibetan Plateau and runs for over 3,000 miles to the sea. For most of that distance, it behaves like any other river. Then it crosses a place called the Loess Plateau. Loess is wind-blown silt, fine, yellow, loosely packed dust, hundreds of feet deep in places, some of it laid down over millions of years. It has almost no resistance to water. The river cuts through it like a knife through flour, and it carries the flour away. By the time the Yellow River leaves the plateau, it is not carrying water with some mud in it. It is carrying mud with some water in it, the muddiest large river on the planet, hauling more than 1.5 billion tons of sediment toward the sea every year. And here is the fact that turns a river into a sorrow. When the river reaches the flat plain of eastern China, it slows down. Slow water cannot carry heavy silt. So the silt drops. It settles on the riverbed. The riverbed rises. Year after year, the bottom of the river climbs higher. Not the water level, the ground beneath the water, For thousands of years, the people living beside it responded the only way they knew how. When the river rose, they built the banks higher. The river silted up. The bed rose. They raised the walls. The bed rose again. They raised the walls again. The result is one of the strangest landscapes on Earth. For hundreds of miles across the lower plain, the Yellow River does not run in a valley. It runs in a channel perched on top of the land, held in by walls, flowing above the fields, above the roads, in places more than 30 feet above the roofs of the cities beside it. It is a suspended river, a river in the sky, held up by earthen walls and human vigilance and nothing else, and every ton of silt it drops raises it a little higher above the people it is meant to feed. So the question is not whether a river held above a city will one day come down into it. The record answers that. 26 times the record answers that. The questions are the ones underneath. Why did a civilization that knew the river would fall keep building higher walls to hold it up for 3,000 years instead of getting out of the way? Why is the Yellow River the deadliest single geographic feature in human history? And why has almost no one outside China ever heard its name? Who was standing on that dike near Zhengzhou in the last week of September, 1887, and what did they see in the seconds before it went? And the most uncomfortable question of all, the river is still up there. The bed is still rising. 400 million people now live in the basin it drains. If it happened before, on a schedule the records can show you what exactly is holding it up tonight. By the end of this video, you will understand why the emperors of China measured their right to rule by whether they could control this one river. You will understand what actually happens in the first hours after a suspended river comes down, hour by hour, in a landscape with nowhere higher to run. You will understand why, 50 years after 1887, a government did to its own people, on purpose, the exact thing the river did by accident, and killed 500,000 of them to do it. And you will understand the number that Chinese engineers do not like to say out loud, how much higher the riverbed has climbed since the last wall was built. But it starts on a plain in Henan, on a warm night at the end of a long, dry autumn, at the moment the wall stopped holding. It is late September, 1887. The summer rains, which usually come in July, came late and came hard. Along the great southern dike below Zhengzhou, in the province of Henan, the water has been high for weeks. The men who watch the dike walk it in shifts, day and night, the way their fathers walked it and their grandfathers before them. They carry lanterns. They carry bundles of sorghum stalks and sacks of earth to plug the small leaks, the seeps, the boils, the places where water finds a channel through the packed earth and begins, quietly, to widen it. A dike does not fail all at once. It fails at one point, the size of a fist, and then the size of a man, and then it is no longer failing. It is gone. The river here sits more than 20 feet above the fields on the other side of the wall. On one side, black water pressing against earth in the dark. On the other side, 20 feet down, villages asleep. Cooking fires banked for the night. Children on sleeping platforms. Grain stored for a winter that most of them will not see. Somewhere along that wall, in the last week of the month, a watchman's lantern finds a boil that is bigger than it was an hour ago. The water coming through it is no longer clear. It is carrying earth. That is the sign every man on the dike has been taught to fear, because water that carries earth is water that is eating the wall from the inside. He shouts. Men come running with sacks and stalks. They pack the hole. The water finds another way. They pack that one. The river has all the time in the world and all the weight of a plateau behind it. And the men have sorghum stalks and their hands. And then the ground beneath their feet is no longer ground. The breach opens the way ice breaks, a crack, a groan, and then a section of wall the length of a street simply is not there anymore. The river does not trickle through. It is under pressure, 20 feet of head behind it, and it comes through the gap as a wall of water and mud moving faster than a man can run, carrying pieces of the dike with it like a battering ram made of the wall's own body. The men on the dike are the first to go. There is no high ground to reach. The high ground was the dike, and the dike is what is killing them. Below, in the villages, people wake to a sound they will describe, the ones who live, as thunder that does not stop, not a clap. A continuous grinding roar coming out of the dark from the direction of the river, growing, and by the time anyone understands what it is, the water is already in the room. The flood spreads across the plain, not as a rising tide, but as an advancing front, a moving edge of black water that reaches a village and takes it and moves on. There is no current to swim against because it is not water behaving like a river. It is a lake being born, and the villages are simply where the lake decides to be. By morning, the breach is not half a mile wide. It is widening still, and the river, the whole river, the entire Yellow River, is no longer going to the sea by its old road. It has found a new one, across the fields, and it will keep pouring through that gap for months, because a river does not stop to let you rebuild the wall. 50,000 square miles go under, 11 cities, 1,500 villages, farmland that fed a region, buried under a foot of the same yellow silt that raised the riverbed in the first place, the river burying the living under the same material it used to climb above them. In the first days, the dead are those the water reached. In the weeks after, the dead are those it did not. Water kills quickly. What water leaves behind kills slowly, and it kills more. The flood of 1887 drowned somewhere in the hundreds of thousands of people in its opening act. The number that pushes the total toward 2 million comes from the second flood, the one made of hunger and disease, and it arrives on a schedule as predictable as the water. First, the food. The flood came in autumn, at harvest, and it took the harvest, both the grain already stored and the fields that would have fed the region through the following year. On a floodplain 50,000 square miles wide, there is no neighboring valley with a surplus, because the neighboring valley is under the same water. 2 million survivors of the flood are now 2 million people with nothing to eat, in a landscape where every road is mud and every bridge is gone. Then the cold. Central China in winter drops below freezing. The survivors have no houses. The houses are gone or full of silt, and no fuel and no walls. They gather on whatever high ground remains, the tops of the very dikes that failed them, narrow ribbons of earth crowded with tens of thousands of people, surrounded by water on both sides. Then the disease. Standing water over a landscape full of the dead is the ideal machine for producing cholera, typhus, dysentery. It moves through the refugee camps faster than any relief can arrive, and relief in 1887 arrives on foot, across a plain that no longer has roads. The Qing government sends aid. It is not enough, and it is not fast, and the failure of the state to protect its people from the river becomes, as it always has in Chinese history, a political fact. For 3,000 years, the Chinese held a belief about their rulers, that an emperor governed by the mandate of heaven, and that floods, earthquakes, and famines were heaven's signal that the mandate was being withdrawn. A dynasty that could not control the Yellow River was a dynasty that heaven had stopped trusting. The Qing dynasty would fall 24 years later. It did not fall because of the flood. But the flood was written into the ledger against it, the way every great flood of the Yellow River had been written into the ledger against every dynasty before, for as long as there had been dynasties to keep the ledger. That is why the river is not just a river in Chinese history. Controlling it was the definition of the right to rule, and no one, in 3,000 years, ever controlled it for long. There is a reason we can say 26 times with confidence. There is a reason we know the river changed its entire course in 1855, and in 1494, and in the year 11 of the Common Era, and dozens of times before that. The Chinese kept records. The longest, most complete record of a single natural hazard anywhere on Earth belongs to this river. Court officials logged the breaches. Local magistrates logged the floods. Engineers logged the repairs, the failures, the exact points where the wall gave way, going back more than 2,000 years. And where the paper record runs out, the ground keeps the rest. The city of Kaifeng sits in Henan. Downstream, on the plain, the river has flooded again and again. Kaifeng was once one of the largest cities on Earth, the capital of the northern Song Dynasty, a metropolis of perhaps 1 million people around the year 1100. Dig beneath modern Kaifeng, and you do not find one city. You find at least 6, stacked vertically, each buried by Yellow River silt, each rebuilt by survivors on top of the flood deposit that entombed the one before. The Song Dynasty Palace lies more than 20 feet below the current streets. A city built, buried, and rebuilt in the same footprint 6 times because the people would not leave and the river would not stop coming. Today, the riverbed beside Kaifeng runs, depending on the year and the silt, as much as 30 feet above the streets of the city. You can stand in Kaifeng and look up at the river. The people who live there live their whole lives below the waterline of a river they cannot see, held back by a wall. The lesson written in the layers under Kaifeng is the same one written in the 2,000 years of court records. It is not a warning about one flood. It is a pattern. The river silts, the bed rises, the walls go up, the deficit between the river and the land grows, and then, on no fixed schedule but with total certainty, the river comes down, and the survivors build on top of the disaster and start the clock again. The engineers who study the Yellow River today are not trying to predict whether it will happen. The record settled that question thousands of years ago. They are trying to answer the only open question the record leaves. Not if, and not really how, but when and how high the water will be when it does. If the theme of the great forgotten catastrophes, the ones that killed more people than the disasters everyone remembers and left almost no trace in the textbooks, is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are rivers, mountains, and coastlines with body counts most of the world has never heard, and we are working through all of them. And now, back to the river, because there is a part of this story that is harder to tell than the flood, and it is the part where human beings did the river's work for it on purpose. 51 years after 1887, in June of 1938, the Yellow River flooded the same plain again. Roughly the same region, a comparable number of dead, somewhere between 500,000 and nearly 1 million. The dike did not fail. It was opened by soldiers on the orders of their own government. In the summer of 1938, the armies of Imperial Japan were advancing west across the North China Plain, following the rail lines toward the strategic city of Zhengzhou, the same Zhengzhou near the 1887 breach. The Chinese nationalist government, unable to stop the advance by force, made a decision that has almost no equal in the history of warfare. They decided to use the river as a weapon. At a place called Huang near Zhengzhou, nationalist troops broke open the southern dike of the Yellow River deliberately to turn the suspended river loose onto the plain and drown the roads the Japanese army needed to advance. It worked, in the narrow sense that a decision like that can work. The flood stopped the mechanized advance. The Japanese could not move armor across a new inland sea. It also did to the Chinese people exactly what the river had done in 1887, except this time there was a hand on the wall. The water spread across 3 provinces. Estimates of the dead run from 400,000 to nearly 900,000 Chinese civilians, drowned or starved by their own army's decision to weaponize the one force in their country that no army could aim. Millions more became refugees. The flooded zone remained a swamp for years, and the river did not return to its old course until 1947, after the war was over, when engineers finally closed the breach that soldiers had opened. Sit with what that tells you about this river. A modern government, facing invasion, looked at the Yellow River and understood, correctly, that it was the most powerful weapon available to them, more powerful than any army in the field. They understood the physics of the suspended river so well that they turned it into artillery. The river did not care that this time a human opened the wall. The water behaved in 1938 exactly as it had behaved in 1887 and exactly as it had behaved in the year 11 of the Common Era. The same silt, the same perched channel, the same plain, lower than the water. The only variable that ever changes is what opens the wall, the river's own weight, or a man with a reason, and the plain does not know the difference. Now bring the numbers to the present, because this is where the story stops being history. The Yellow River Basin today is home to more than 400 million people, a population larger than the entire United States, living in the drainage of a river that has drowned its own plain more than 1,500 times. The lower river still runs above the land. For roughly the last 500 miles before the sea, the bed of the Yellow River sits higher than the surrounding fields, in places by more than 30 feet, held in by dikes that are now longer, taller, and more heavily engineered than anything the men of 1887 could have imagined, and holding back a riverbed that is still rising. Because the physics did not change, the Loess Plateau is still there. The river still cuts it, and still carries the silt down onto the plain, and still drops it when it slows. Every year the bed climbs a little higher above the 400 million people who live beneath it. China has fought back with the largest river engineering effort in human history. In 1960, they finished the Sanmenxia Dam, and learned within a few years that a dam on the muddiest river on Earth silts up so fast that it can lose its own capacity, and that holding the silt back upstream starves the lower channel and creates new problems downstream. In 2001, they finished the Xiaolangdi Dam, and with it invented a strategy found almost nowhere else on Earth. Once a year, engineers deliberately release a controlled surge of water and stored sediment, a man-made flood, to scour the silt out of the lower riverbed and flush it to the sea before it can raise the bed any higher. Think about what that means. The most advanced water engineers in the world, on a river their civilization has studied for 3,000 years, have concluded that the only way to keep the suspended river from rising is to flood it on purpose, every single year, forever. Not to solve the problem, to hold it in place for one more year. That is not control. That is a truce that has to be renegotiated every summer against a river that has broken every truce ever offered it. The oldest story in Chinese civilization is a flood story. Around 4,000 years ago, at the very beginning of the recorded Chinese tradition, on the edge between legend and history, the founding hero of the first dynasty was not a warrior or a king. He was a flood engineer. His name was Yu, the Great Yu. And the reason he is remembered as the founder of civilization is that he was the man who, according to the tradition, finally tamed the Great Flood, not by building walls to hold the water back, the way his father had tried and failed, but by dredging channels to lead the water away. He is said to have worked for 13 years, and to have passed the door of his own home 3 times in those years without going in, because the work of controlling the river could not stop. 4,000 years later, that is still the founding image the Chinese state holds of itself. Legitimate rule is the control of water. The mandate of heaven runs through the dikes of the Yellow River. Every dynasty inherited the same river, the same silt, the same rising bed, and the same impossible promise that this time the wall would hold. None of them kept it. Not the Han, not the Song, not the Ming, not the Qing. The river broke through under all of them, and the breaking was written into the ledger of heaven against each one in turn. The flood of 1887 was one entry in a ledger that is 3,000 years long and still open. And underneath the whole story is a single, quiet, physical fact that no dynasty and no engineer has ever changed. A river that carries 1.5 billion tons of silt to a flat plain will raise its own bed above the land, and a river above the land will eventually come down onto it. You can raise the walls, you can flush the bed, you can weaponize it, dam it, dredge it, log its every breach for 2,000 years. You cannot make the silt stop falling. The great Yu dredged channels 4,000 years ago because he understood that you cannot win a wall-building contest against a river that raises itself. 4,000 years later, the deepest lesson of the Yellow River is that his descendants are still, mostly, building walls, because 400 million people already live below the waterline, and the one thing you cannot do with a river in the sky is ask the people beneath it to move. The Yellow River is rising as you watch this, not in flood. In the ordinary, silent, daily way, it has risen for 1,000,000 years, a river dropping its silt onto its own bed, lifting itself, grain by grain, a little further above the plain it feeds and the cities it shadows. The rise is not metaphorical. It is measured. Engineers watch it the way doctors watch a pressure they cannot cure, only manage, 1 year at a time. 26 times in the written record, the river has come all the way down and started over. In 1887, it killed up to 2 million people and helped end a dynasty. In 1938, it killed most of 1,000,000 more, on purpose, at the hands of the people it was meant to feed. Under the streets of Kaifeng lie 6 buried cities, each one a place where people looked up at a river above their roofs and decided, again, to stay. The dikes are higher now than they have ever been. The dams are the largest ever built. The engineers are the best the world has produced, and once a year they flood the river themselves to buy 1 more year of the bed not rising. And still the silt falls, and still the bed climbs, and still 400 million people sleep beneath a river held up by earthen walls and human vigilance, and the annual decision to try again. The record doesn't tell you the year the wall gives way. It never has. The Chinese have kept the finest flood record on Earth for 2,000 years, and the one number it has never once contained is the date of the next one. That blank space is where 400 million people live. 1887, 1938. The river has broken its plane more than 1,500 times, and it has never, in all of recorded history, been finished. The next entry has not yet been written down. But the silt is still falling, and the river is still rising, and it is still up there, above the rooftops tonight, waiting, the way it has always waited for the wall to stop holding,